So, you guys will be doing 7 different techniques. It'll be dry brush, wet on wet, wet on dry, wet on wet number 1, which is color on top of wet paint. And then we'll do wet on wet number 2, which is a wet brush on wet paper. We'll do blending, blooming, and layering. So you guys can work with, I would say like 3 to 4 colors. I wouldn't say get super crazy. Pick a couple of your favorites. I'm just gonna do a purple, a little bit, and I'm not using a lot, like dot dot, not a lot, if you guys have heard that a lot before. So I'm just doing like a pea size amount of paint. And I'm just gonna pick 3 colors here. 2, and let's do a green. Cool. All right. So that is about all the amount of paint I'm using. Not a lot, very tiny bit. You won't need a lot. Has anyone ever heard of gouache paints before? Has anyone ever used gouache paints before? Kinda, sorta. Do you know how they work? Are they similar to anything? You use them? Yeah. Totally. They're a very nice building bridge between acrylic and watercolor. Online, or kind of like the general basis is gouache is like an opaque watercolor. So we can still dilute it down with water and kind of get that wash overlaying, get that kind of like watercolor feel. But then we can also use straight up pigment, like we couldn't use for watercolor, to get like a really thick, dense paint color. So with dry brush, very similar. I'm just going in with a dry brush. These paints will feel a little bit goopier. What I mean by that is they're kind of like a thicker kind of paint consistency. So we can use a little bit of water to dye it down. I'm not gonna use anything just for the dry brush because we're using dry brush, dry paper. It'll kind of give you same effect of that watercolor, little paint, kind of play around with it. Cool, right? Now we're gonna move on to wet on dry. This is where I'm gonna add a little bit of water to my actual paint. With gouache, it's really important that we keep our brushes super clean. So if we're using like purple and then we dip into water and we go into blue, we just have to make sure our paintbrush is super dry, clean. I'm still working in the purple. I'm adding like 2 drops of water, like not a lot, and it really will activate your thick paint here. It kind of becomes sort of a little bit of a goopier paint. Okay, a little bit less boogery consistency. So then we've got wet on dry. So this is wet paint on dry paper here. I don't have a ton of pigment on my paper, or on my brush, I'm sorry. So it goes on a little bit thicker than watercolor. You can really build it up way quicker. See, it's super dark, super thick, super consistent. Really nice. Cool. I'm gonna start with my layering here second, just because we're gonna do a color and then we're gonna layer another color on top of it. So it needs to fully dry first. So I'm gonna completely wash my brush, and then I'm adding a little bit of water to like one of these empty panels here. Then I'm gonna take a little bit of my paint on my brush. I really want like a thick color paint. Okay, cool. Got this. I'm gonna layer this down. And we're working on a cold press watercolor paper. And what that is it's the same thing as watercolor, but when it's pressed with cold water instead of hot water. So we get a really smooth, thin consistency. So when you guys are painting on it, it'll feel a little bit different than that watercolor paper. It's really smooth. It doesn't have those dry, kind of bumpy edges. So it'll feel a little bit different, goes on a little bit smoother. Cool. I'm gonna let that chill for a minute. Now we're gonna do wet on wet, which is color on top of wet paint. So I'm gonna take some wet paint here, on here. I'm not wetting my paper, I'm just wetting the paint. Cool. I'm gonna super clean this. I forgot to grab a piece of paper towel. So I've got wet paint on there. I'm gonna dry off my brush. I'm gonna go in some dry paint, or wet paint, I guess. I'm gonna add it right on top. So it's not as much of a blend as it would be with watercolors. If I were to put wet paint on top of wet paint, it would really like merge together. It'd probably get a little bit muddier, a little bit quicker. So you can kind of control that, blend a little bit more. You can see it's still kind of got the watery consistency, but you can still see the difference between the two. Cool. Then we got wet on wet number 2, which is wet brush on wet paper. So I'm pretty sure you guys could get that. We wet the paper a little bit. I'm gonna take some straight pigment and go right in there. Same thing, just like your watercolor. Just plays around a little differently. Cool. Blending, here's where you're not really gonna use a lot of water. It's basically just gonna be straight pigment. And we're gonna blend the two together using a little bit of water. So how we do that is I'm gonna add a little bit more in here because this is a little bit too watered down for me. I want a little bit more of straight pigment. I'm gonna take some of that. I'm gonna put it straight down in here. Now I'm gonna take a separate brush because I want it to be clean. And I'm gonna add some of that blue on this side. And how to get a nice like blend in between the two together is, if you guessed it, would be water. I'm gonna start pulling in here. I'm gonna go back with my purple brush. And I'm washing off most of the pigment, so it's a pretty clean brush. And then I'm just gonna add a little bit of water in here. And I'm pulling it up and down. I'm not going left to right, because that'll kind of, you can, but then it starts to like muddy it up a little bit. So I'm going up and down, kind of back and forth. And after a while, you'll start to create a nice blend from blue to purple, or whatever 2 colors you choose. Amazing. Last one is blooming. Blooming is where we do wet on wet. It's kind of like dripping, but it's a little bit more controlled. So we'll do a wet wash on here. And we want it like, not like so wet that like it's like a puddle on here, but pretty wet. And then we'll take our color here and water it down just a tiny bit. And then I'm gonna take the tip of my brush and just do. See how it's kind of, I guess you could say the word blooming, kind of separates there. The more water you add, the more it'll bloom. I'm gonna add even more water for the dramatic effect. This is great if you're doing like little flowers on top of like a grass field, or if you wanna have little like fireworks sort of effects. Pretty cool. Cool. So the reason we did this layering first is because we're gonna add color on top of it. Here's the difference between watercolor and gouache, is we can get like really thick paint right on top of it. So it's really nice. It's like adding white highlights. You know, like adding the white highlights is always kind of like the bane of my existence too, because it's always hard. You can never get like a really thick white right away. So with gouache, it's really nice because you can add straight pigment right on top and get that really cool result. So I'll take this. I'm gonna take a little bit of my paint. Goopy. I don't want a lot. I'm like layering it just on the tip of my brush too, just so I can like get that kind of control straight line. You can pull that white right on top and it stays super nice, super opaque, super clear and point. So it's really nice if you want to add like white highlights or details afterwards, if you want to do like an outline. Got the hiccups now. Really dry my brush off, grab some of that blue. So it's nice too, because it like, even if you add like a wet paint on top of it, it doesn't activate the color underneath it. Whereas if watercolor, if I were to use like a wet color on top of a wet, or even if, sorry, I'm not making sense at all. Let's say I painted a watercolor color down, I let it dry, and then I added like a wet paint on top of it, it would reactivate that layer underneath it. So if I painted it green and wanted to add blue on top, if I added wet blue on top, it would make that green become wet and kind of muddy around a little bit. So it's nice with gouache because you have a lot more control. I can still wet down my blue a little bit, and it doesn't reactivate that green underneath. Cool, amazing, fantastic.